Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whether you are in Beijing, China, or Palm Springs, California. This is Funny Like Mom Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Wirth, episode 146. Only what, four away from the big 150, and I'm on vacation. I'd like to tell you, you know, what I'm going to do for 150. I should have it planned out by now. I mean, I got some ideas, but I can't say I got a confirmed guest. But let's hope something works out, man. May 5th, 2022. As always, today's episode is brought to you by G Vegas Buffalo Sauce. Go to www.gvegas.webs.com. Order it there, get it shipped right to your door. Go green, go fresh. Put the whamma jamma in your mouth because that's what happens. Second, you take a bite into some buffalo sauce from G Vegas. First thing you say is whamma jamma. Then you put the whamma jamma in your mouth, man. You want to talk about whamma jamma? Here's a whamma jamma comedian, pioneer for female comedians in her own right. Elaine Boosler, and she's one of the few working comics in the 70s and 80s. Because I mean, nowadays, with the Whitney Cummings and Amy Schumers and Wanda Sykes, it's a common thing. There's just as many female comics as there are male comics working in this business. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was a male-dominated business. Okay, so to be one of the few female comics, period, but to be a working female comic, that was almost unheard of in the 70s and certainly into the early 80s. Let's see. She broke ground with her observational comedy about being a single woman and her political commentary, which, I mean, nowadays, those are common things. Back in the 70s and 80s, again, unheard of. Okay, so she's breaking ground in what today is a common thing that female comics do, or any comic does for that matter. Let's see. 1985, she had her own comedy special, Party of One. It was a self-produced, one of the first female comics to appear on cable TV in a 1 hour long special. Let's see, Richard Lewis, called the Jackie Robinson of our time. I think Jackie Robinson, first black baseball player. Breaking ground for black baseball players, and she's breaking ground for female comics in the business. One of the strongest working female comics, Richard Lewis called her, and broke the mold for the female comic in this industry. Rolling Stone magazine called her the first lady of stand-up comedy in 1988 and put her on their 2017 list of 50 greatest comedians of all time. Let's see. 2018, CNN called her groundbreaking woman comic in American comedy. So, I mean, when you're getting the attention of all these great comedy, reviewers, I mean, you're certainly catching somebody's eye right there. You're doing good stuff in the world of comedy. Let's see. New York Times called a comedy master who hasn't gotten her due. Okay, so somebody's calling you a master of your art. You're pretty damn good at what you're doing right there, and and you've heard it before, man. Some comics, they have success overnight, and other comics that are very, very talented, good comics, it takes them forever and ever just to break into this business. So it's not an easy business. I found that out firsthand. Okay, years later. Let's see. It's kill or be killed. It's a cutthroat business, and certainly, I mean, you can be loved in a cutthroat business. That's not an easy thing to do. Let's see. Her father was an acrobat, and mother was a ballerina. So performing was in her genes. It was in her bloodline. She took singing and dancing lessons as a child, which that's a lost art. I remember as a kid, it's like you always tried to give piano lessons or something or dancing lessons, something to your kids. Where I mean, today we do it more as a recreation. Where back then it was you need to have some sort of challenge your art form. Okay. She got exposed to comedy actually on family vacations. This is one of the more interesting ones that we've ever talked about, how people get started in comedy. Family vacations to Vegas. She was too young to gamble, so while her family was gambling, she was stuck hanging out in the lounge, and she started listening to comics that were performing in the lounge, and that generated her interest in comedy. Was watching them because she couldn't gamble. So maybe instead of a gambling addiction, she ended up in a comedy addiction. Maybe, who knows? It might be a better route where she went. Let's see, graduated high school in 1969. She dropped out of the University of Florida after 2 years there. Worked 6 months in the Bahamas as a singer and dancer, which, went back to her childhood roots. Before she returned to her hometown of New York City. 1973, she actually got her start at the Improv in New York City by complete accident. She was working there as a singing waitress, where she'd sing in between the comedic acts. While they were changing up comedic acts, she'd sing. Which I went to the Brad Garrett Comedy Club, and I noticed like Brad Garrett was on stage telling jokes, and the waitress, while she was serving everybody, it was like she'd heckle him, but it was like you could tell Brad Garrett told her to heckle him because everything she heckled, he turned into a joke on stage. So you could tell after the first 3-4 heckles that this was part of the act. It wasn't her just randomly heckling the guy. Like he was waiting, for her to heckle something, to have something to feed off and create it into a comedy routine. So as she was working there as the singing waitresses, one of the comics didn't show up that night, so she ended up taking the stage in his place and told 1 hour of jokes, which I found impressive because, man, when you want to do comedy and you're starting out, you can't do an hour of jokes. Okay, I mean, you're lucky if you get 5 minutes. I remember when I first started, writing my routines. I sat down, I wrote. I looked, I'm like, I got about an hour of material here. Then when you do it in live time, I had about 5 minutes. Okay, when you start speaking words, it takes a whole lot quicker than when you're writing them down. It takes a long time. So do an hour your first night out. That's extremely impressive. Luckily for her, Andy Kaufman was actually there that night, and he saw her do her set and told her, "Hey, you ought to quit waitressing and try comedy. You really got a talent for it." So he's one of the biggest names in comedy at the time, who's catching your act and telling you, "Hey, you got a niche for this, man. You ought to go for it." So she went for it, and by 1976, Jimmy Walker, Dynamite, he was managing her. So you got Jimmy Walker as your manager after a few years in the business. That's impressive. She had multiple articles in New York Magazine. I guess you could say she was a natural. She had an appearance on Saturday Night Live under her belt. And what comic? That's the ultimate. That's the godfather of comedy television shows right there, Saturday Night Live. Had an appearance on the Merv Griffin Show to her credit. Once she made a go of it in New York, she decided to move to LA, which, we've spoken of that before. Nowadays, you can turn on your internet from home, become an internet star. Okay. You can be a star from anywhere in the world. Back then, if you wanted to be a star in comedy, you either moved to New York or you moved to LA. You weren't going to do it as a local comedian. Okay. You were only going to get so far. You wanted to, even today, I mean, if you want to hit the real big time, those are the big meccas, New York and LA. You can get, like Boston, it's a great mecca. They say it's great to get you ready to go there to Boston or LA. I mean, you got the Lenny Clarks where, you can become a national star out of Boston, but it's much more of a common thing in New York or LA, where back in the day, you weren't becoming a big time star like Lenny Clark, is out of Boston. You had to move to one of these major cities. You had to sell everything in the house, pack up your car, move to New York, LA, sleep in your car, and really go. That's when you really go for it. Okay, it's not like, hey, you got an apartment in the suburbs and you work all day, come home, turn on your internet, and you're some kind of internet comedian, and you go out on the weekends and do no bullshit. You're really going for it back then. You're selling your life for your art. That's what you're doing back then. And how many nights do you sleep in your car in LA with no food to eat because you got no job because you're doing comedy, and say, hey, do I tuck tail and drive back home and live a normal life, or do I stick this out and actually go for it? And the ones that actually went for it turned out to be the legends, and she was certainly one of them. She got her shot on the Tonight Show, which we've talked about that. If you get on Tonight Show nowadays, it's a very cool thing. Back then, you got on Tonight Show, you were a made comic. You were working for the rest of your life because you had that big Tonight Show credit to your name. Unfortunately, it was when Johnny Carson was out of town. So to have the credit we are on the Tonight Show is big, but to have the credit you on the Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, that's the godfather right there. But he was out. Helen Reddy was guest hosting, which so she got on it, but not with Johnny. It was with a guest host, which, hey, still ain't bad. Okay, you're still at the top of your game. Became a regular at the Comedy Store, the legendary comedy venue that Richard Pryor and Sam Kinison and Roseanne Barr and all the legends, Dangerfield came up at. But I found back then, because Chance Langdon, he's a big Boston comedian, okay, and he was out there during the Comedy Store's early days, and it's not the big tourist attraction it is today. Okay, back then he said he was driving by and he saw open mic night, sign up, which nowadays you got to get into a lottery to sign up just for an open mic night there. Okay, you have to actually win a lottery to get a spot because so many comics want to get in there. And back then he was driving by. He said, "Sign up, go up." So he pulled in the Comedy Store, signed up. He went up. Mitzi Shore, this was before she was the legendary Mitzi Shore. She seen Chance and had a guy go over and tell him, "Hey, Mitzi said, if you want, you're a paid regular here." After performing there one time a drive-by open mic, that was how good he was. So certainly not the Comedy Store it was, now, but still, I mean, they got every now and then they got you're right on top of LA, which is the TV capital of the world. So you want to get on TV, a lot of nights there'd be, TV directors, producers, whatever, hanging out at the Comedy Store. You had a good set, that's where you got noticed. Now at the Comedy Store, they got 3 rooms. They got the main room, which is for the big stars. They got the what's it called? They got like a secondary room, which is for like the mid-level comics coming up. Then they got the belly room upstairs, which is for the up-and-coming comics. Okay. Well, she was new, and usually, like I said, women comics, or they weren't a part of the main comedy stream. But most of them, they had woman nights in the belly room upstairs. But she wouldn't take that. She refused to perform there. She said, "Hey, I'm as good as any guy comic you got here. I'm as big a star as any guy comic got here." So instead of going to the belly room, she took the main stage with acts like Jimmy Walker, Freddie Prinze, Jay Leno, Richard Lewis, Richard Belzer, Ed Bluestein. I mean, the biggest names in comedy at the time. She was right in with the mix. She said, "No, you ain't put me no woman show. I can hold my own with the guys." And so she proved she could. Boozer became known for her rapid fire delivery, which is just like machine gun style, boom, 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 one quick joke after another. Which I was actually on a show with a local comic, Larry Lee Lewis, God rest his soul, he passed away. But man, we did a rough bar one night, and we couldn't, if you told a quick joke, they'd listen to that. But if you got any story joke or anything like that, they tune you out. They were more or less shooting pool and drinking or whatever. And man, me and another comic, we did our sets. I did so. Next comic bombed. The third comic was Larry Lee Lewis. He went up there, and we called him locally. He was king of the one-liners. He just started rapid fire, shooting out one-liners, got the whole crowd into the thing because he didn't give them time to tune them out. So being able to do rapid fire comedy, it's great for a rough room. I can tell you that much. I've known that. She also got known for her doing observational humor, where she talk about, things she observed in her real life, like being a single woman. Those are things she told, jokes about. Where her female predecessors, say the Joan Rivers and the Phyllis Dillers, those are the groundbreaking women before Elaine Boosler. They were more self-deprecating comics where they tell, they put people down or put themselves down, or she was doing more of an observational thing rather than putting herself down. So she was breaking ground in that for any comic or a female comic at the time. After a while, Johnny Carson actually stopped using her after she refused to read some self-deprecating jokes that were written for her, which, if you get onto the Tonight Show after you're a big star or whatever, they have, your monologue or whatever, and they have writers. Johnny Carson, you can't come up with great jokes every night. You need a writing team to help you do that. So, they'll write some jokes for the people coming out in the monologue or whatever they got to do. And, they're asking her to do jokes that wasn't her style. And she said, "No, that isn't what I do, and I'm not going to do them." And you don't mess with Johnny Carson. A lot of people found that out early on. And let's see. Letterman actually brought her back, which was a ballsy move when he guest hosted for. This was before the Letterman show, when he was still guest hosting for the Tonight Show. Well, when Carson was out, they called in David Letterman to guest host, and he had Elaine Boosler back on after Johnny Carson told her, "You ain't coming back on because you refused to read the jokes my writers wrote for you." That was a ballsy move by Letterman right there, because Carson could have told Letterman, "Hey, you're out, man. You ain't guest hosting. You want to." Remember, who was it? Carson banned Joan Rivers from the show because didn't get his permission, to go open or do her own sitcom on Fox TV, her own late night show. And he thought that was a stab in the back. And even when Jay Leno took over the show, he wouldn't have Joan Rivers back because he wanted to respect what the Godfather Johnny Carson had in precedence after that. Then when Jimmy Fallon took it over, he had Joan Rivers back on the show. He wasn't anybody's bitch. It was a new day and age. He was taking over. So. And it was a genius joke. We've talked about it on the show. Letterman, after he did get the Late Show, he started having Boosler on as a regular. So she lost the Tonight Show, but gained the Late Show. So always good to keep friends in the business. When one door closes, another opens. That's what they say. She was told no one would ever watch a female comedy hour on television. So nobody, even as successful as she was, nobody give her a 1 hour special on. That was the big thing. Like today, it's Netflix. You get a Netflix special you made. Before that, it was the Comedy Central special. Well, before that, it was the pay TV. It was the HBOs, the Cinemax, the Showtime. It was the pay-per-view channels. That if you were a big-time comic, that's where you wanted to be. That's where people were tuning in. And But she was told nobody had ever watched a female comic, 1 hour special, so they wouldn't pay her to do it as popular as she was. She said, okay, I'll prove you wrong. She ended up financing her own special, which I financed my own movie, okay? And I can tell you it's a very stupid thing to do because you'd be very lucky if you get your money back, okay? Or even half of your money back you're going to do it. So it was a ballsy move for her to finance her own special, but she had to prove him wrong, and so she did. It turned out to be a big success, and by proving him wrong, she was actually asked back to Showtime to do 2 more specials. So first one was so successful. They say, hey, you paid for the first one, but it was success. Hey, we'll pay for the second and third. You just come on back and do it. So that must have been a good kiss my ass moment for her, and proving them wrong like that. Those are the ones you look for right there. She appeared on Larry King Live, open for a bunch of 70s musical acts, which, I mean, even today, if you can open for like a big band or something, which, I have a comedian. I remember Andrew Dice Clay got to open up for Guns N' Roses. He said he was nervous till about the first 5 minutes, and he could have did it for an hour because they really accepted the Dice, man. It was a great move. Let's see, some of the musical acts show up: Helen Reddy, Ben Vereen, and Johnny Mathis. She performed Queen Elizabeth of the London Palladium. I mean, imagine performing for a queen. How big are you in comedy? You get to do that. She got her own White House Correspondents' Dinners during the Clinton era. Part of a performance for Congress at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. that was also broadcast on ABC, national television right there for you. She was interviewed for CNN's History of Comedy in 2018. Then she got a big break in TV, starring the TV's 1992 NBA series, The Shape of Things. Appeared on the Andy Kaufman Show, big show he had back then, and co-host the Cable Ace Awards. So she's getting her TV stuff in, paying her dues, because that's what you hope in comedy, to get that big comedy sitcom and become the big Cosby Show of the era, or all the big comedy shows you had at the time. She had guest roles on, as we mentioned, the Cosby Show, Night Court, Living Strange, Dear John, and Sisters. And I forgot about Dear John. That was Judd Hirsch or whatever from Taxi, played Alex in Taxi. Yeah, Dear John was one of his. I remember I watched it too. It was a short-lived sitcom, but it was very good. Became one of the regular on Hollywood Squares, which all the big comedians. I remember we talked about the Gilbert Gottfried "You Fool" series, where he gave a bunch of consecutive good or bad answers, and the guests got them all wrong. But so many comics were on Hollywood Squares back in the day. That's one of the game shows I wish they'd bring back. They got what is it? Whose Line Is It Anyway, or something like that, where every answer is a joke. I mean, that's a good comedy related, where there are a bunch of comedians on who give you funny answers to questions. But I mean, some of the classic ones, that was a classic for comedian shows. I remember Milton Berle was on that, Joan Rivers was on that. Who Got the Center Square? That was the big one. That was the first one, the object of the game. The center square is the hot one. So you were always the first one to get asked a question. Wrote and directed 2 half-hour comedy movies for Cinemax. She was on HBO's Comic Relief, which, I mean, that was what, I think Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, and Robin Williams were the main ones. And I remember my hero, Sam Kinison, was good friends with Robin Williams. They never let him on there. He actually, after he was so pissed they wouldn't let him on to help out with Comic Relief, which was it was a relief project to help out the homeless, that he did this big sketch on his album, screw you if you're homeless, this is America, get every opportunity to make something yourself, kiss my two home ass. And he really got pissed off though. He actually attacked him, they wouldn't let him on that, which was a genius move. She's been a guest on Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect. I did a lot of work with CNN. Yeah, they really was one of the hot spots that picked her up. Created a sketch comedy for the Today Show. Hosted a game show herself for PAX TV. She was a comedy writer too, as we mentioned. The great comedians, they all have writers that work for them. She was a writer for Rodney Dangerfield. I think on a special It Ain't Easy Being Me. Wrote jokes for Barbra Streisand, the great singer, that she used as banter in between singing songs, tell a few jokes to lighten up the crowd. And who knew Elaine Boosler was writing them for her? But can you imagine just being connected to those names, Dangerfield, Barbra Streisand? I mean, one of the biggest names in comedy, one of the biggest names in music. I mean, give me a break. Let's see. It wrote articles for Esquire magazine, the Huffington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times. Everybody wanted a piece of this woman because she was so talented. Let's see. She was a big supporter of women's rights. One of the big organizations, a women's reproductive rights assistance project, which was for women who can't pay for contraceptive, emergency contraceptive, or legal abortions. They can't afford them, so she helped out with that stuff. Which I guess, if you're a woman and you don't want your child, I mean, there should be access to. I mean, it's a life, and you got no right to take a life. But I mean, what is a life if your mother don't want you? I mean, it's not much of a life anyway. So I guess I don't know. I guess there's a big legal debate here, but I guess it's a choice. I guess so. Some people wouldn't consider one. Some people do. She was one of the ones who stood up and said, "I think it's a choice." Did a lot of work for animal rescue. Remember donating for kennels and shelters for rescued animals and stuff. Here's one because I mean, you don't know. Well, I remember Whitney Cummings said she had trouble finding dates because all she ever did was comedy, and she didn't want to date comedians because those are your buddies, those are my buddies, those are your work buddies you hang out with, those are my friends. I don't want to date them. Where she took a different route. I mean, that was all she was ever around was comedy, so she dated comedians. Lived with Robin Williams from '77 to '78. She was asked to do an interview for the 2018 HBO documentary Robin Williams Cursed Inside My Mind. She lived with Andy Kaufman for 3 years, and finally in the 2000s she married the manager of the Doors. So I don't know how she met the manager of the Doors, but who cares? They hit it off. They got married, and that was her love ever since. But yeah, geez, just groundbreaking for a woman comic, like we said. The Phyllis Dillers and the Joan Rivers, they were the two big known comics of the time. But other than that, the two big ones, I mean, could you name another female comic from the 70s? There weren't many, let alone working comics. And this woman working as a female comic in the 70s, that was unheard of, man. And she broke ground, paved the way for the Whitney Cummings and the Sarah Silvermans and the Amy Schumers and the Wanda Sykes, and paved the way for it to be just as many, if not more, female comics in the business now than there are male comics, which just gives you more comedy and more laughter is always a good thing. So good to see, women are an equal part of the industry now, and they owe it all to people like Elaine Boosler. Great career, great podcast. And like I said, we're learning the history of comedy, and man, there's the history of comedy for female comics right there, man. People like Elaine Boosler are paving ground, and that's why I love doing this podcast. Just learning how she got started. I mean, what a start to your comedy career. Just taking trips to Vegas with your family, and you're too young to gamble, so you get stuck sucking sodas in the lounge and watching comedy. And instead of growing a passion for gambling, you grow a passion for comedy and have this iconic career. That's what comedy's all about. Keep laughing, folks. Till next time, I'm Dennis Wirth. Tell a joke because it's good to make people laugh. Good night.